Hello everyone and welcome to another middle game episode looking at the pawn structure with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. This video is the second part of the video looking at the weak squares, and we're going to see more examples that will teach us how to create holes in the enemy camp and how to take advantage of them or how to prevent them. So let's get started. In this first position, if we analyze it a little bit, we can see that white is clearly better. White has a lot more space. He also has a hole in the enemy camp on e6, and his pieces are much better placed. So here it's black to move, and in this position, black knows that he needs to do something, and he plays an excellent move, pawn to e5. Here, white responds with the move e4, which is a terrible mistake because he is handing his advantage over to black. Instead, coming back, what white should have played instead is d takes on e6. This will create a hole on d5, from which black would have replied bishop takes e6, and then pawn to e4. And here, black has only two options. He could play f takes e4, from which white will reply with bishop takes e4, holding on to his advantage, or coming back, another try would be knight to h6, from which after bishop to f2, white again is going to hold on to his advantage. But coming back, the game continued with e4. Here black responded with e takes f4, an excellent move. Bishop takes f4, g5, bishop e3, and now f4, another excellent move. Bishop to f2 and knight to e5. And now, suddenly, black has transformed this position and enjoys a great game. His kingside pawn majority promises him good chances against white's king. Also, the hole on e5 is an excellent square for his knight. In this next position, it's black to move, and if you analyze it a little bit, you could see that white's bishop is a very poor piece. However, black's knight doesn't seem to have a very impressive home either. Therefore, you gotta think about what can you do to increase the activity of your pieces. Definitely for black, we need to create a good square for the knight to land on where he's more effective and more dangerous. Also for white, we need to think about what can we do to activate our bishop. Moving the pawn from f3 to f4 might give white a little something on the king side. But what should black do in this case? Well, if you think about the concept of weak squares, here black wants to create a weak square that will be a permanent home for his knight. And with black to move here, the excellent move pawn to b4 was played. Coming back, I want to mention that many times beginners just want to go after the king, but it would be a terrible mistake to play something like f5 trying to attack the king, because here after white plays something like f4, the bishop will suddenly become more active, especially if the pawn on e4 takes on f5. The bishop will have a long-range diagonal where he's going to be very active and pose a lot of threats. So coming back, the best move for black here is to push the pawn to b4. White responded with f4, and this move has its own problems, but it's the only move that will get some counterplay. Coming back, it would be a lot worse to take the pawn on b4 here, because after knight takes b4, let's say queen to c3, rook a2 activating the rook, pawn to f4, e takes f4, rook takes f4. Here black has an excellent move, which is knight to d5, forking the white queen and the rook. If white takes the knight here, after queen to e2, checkmate cannot be prevented. Coming back, f4 was played, rightfully so. Black responds with b takes c3, queen takes c3, rook to a2, f takes e5, and then queen takes e5. Just 4 moves after our initial diagram, and things have radically changed. Now black not only has a rook on the 7th rank, but he is also the master of the b4, d4, and e5 squares. Combine all of that with the awful bishop on g2, and it's clear that white here is strategically lost. Here the game continued with queen to c4, king to g7, b4, rook to e2, rook to f4. Coming back, it would be a terrible mistake here to take on c5, because after queen takes g3, white is totally lost. checkmate cannot be prevented again. So coming back, rook to f4 was played. Knight to d4, rook f to b1. Still hoping for some tactical chances. However, the game continued with knight to e6, rook 4 to f3, queen to b2, rook f3 to f2, rook takes f2, rook takes f2, queen takes b4, winning a pawn, queen to a2, queen to d4, bishop f1, queen e5, king g2, knight to d4. And if we look at this position now, black is up a pawn and can also claim superiority for the minor piece. His knight is dominating on e4, while the bishop doesn't really have much activity, and definitely black is winning here. Now let's come back from the beginning, and then we're going to take a look at this position. We're going to make a slight adjustment and see how that will affect the position. And all we're going to do is add a dark square bishop for both players on c1 and on g7. And here's the new position. We've added a pair of dark square bishops. This means that white can now exchange his dark square bishop for black's knight once the d4 square is cleared away by b5 to b4. One should also note that black's bishop isn't particularly active. Since black still wants to dominate d4 and should still be dreaming of creating a superior minor piece, the following move hopefully makes a lot of sense. And here black moved bishop to h6. Here black offers an exchange of bishops, which would once again lead to a monster knight versus a terrible light square bishop situation. It also tries to turn the inactive g7 bishop into an active participant in the strategic battle that will follow. Here white responds with pawn to f4. Black still wants to activate his knight, so he's going to move the pawn to b4. f5, then bishop takes c1. Black is exchanging his dark square bishop for white's more active dark square bishop. Queen takes c1, b takes c3, queen takes c3, and then queen to f6. Not a pretty looking move, but the pawn on f5 needs to be stopped and not allowed to advance on f6. After which white responds with queen to d2, rook to g8, f takes g6, queen takes g6, queen f2, queen takes g3, queen takes f7 check, rook to g7 blocking the check, queen takes h5 check, king g8, queen to f3, and then queen takes h4. And here black again achieved a much better position due to the excellent hole on d4, where the knight will leap in, attacking the queen. Also, knight coming to e2 is another big threat, attacking the king and threatening checkmating patterns. So you could see how in this game, black traded the dark square bishop because white's dark square bishop was very active, and he would have prevented his knight from becoming superior to white's bishop, and then it created the squares that the knights needed to go on to become more active and put pressure on the white king. And these are the types of decisions that you want to look for in the middle game. There are many instances where a square isn't weak as a whole, where it cannot be challenged by an enemy pawn. However, just because there is a potential of being challenged doesn't mean that you cannot fight for that square and claim it yours. So this is a great example of that sort. In this position, it's black to move, and the d4 square would be an excellent square for black's knight. However, this square is not considered as a whole, as the pawn on c2 could go to c3 and chase the knight away. Just because the d square 4 is not a whole doesn't mean that black cannot fight for it and claim it his and use it for his knight. In this position, black can move the pawn from b5 to b4, preventing the pawn from c2 going on c3 chasing the knight away. Therefore, black can still make the square d4 a permanent home for his knight. Now, in the actual game here, black played the knight to d4 right away due to the fact that he is threatening taking on f3, forking the king, rook, and queen. Therefore, white cannot chase the knight right away with c2 to c3. He has to prevent the knight taking on f3. So here, white moved the queen to f2, and then black moved the excellent move, pawn to b4, preventing c2 to c3, making the knight stable on d4. This move also keeps the pawn on a2 as a backer pawn and a permanent weakness that black can exploit as well. The game continued here with bishop to c4. White here activates his bishop as well. And it's true that moving the pawn from b5 to b4 allowed the bishop to become more active. However, as Fisher said, you've got to give squares to get squares. In the present case, the powerful d4 knight is far superior to the light square bishop, and therefore moving the pawn to b4 was a great move. The game continued with rook to a3, another great move. Since the pawn on a2 is a backer pawn and a great weakness for white, black is trying to freeze it on a2 and then also plan on piling up on it to eventually win that pawn. And the game continued with bishop to d5, attacking the queen, queen to c7, and then rook e to c1. And the idea of this move is that after white will move the pawn from c2 to c3, the rook could come to c2 to guard the a2 weakness if he needs to double up on it. From here, the game continued with queen to a7, c3, b takes on c3, rook takes c3, queen to a5, attacking the rook. Black can't take the a2 pawn just yet, as it's being defended twice by the rook on a1, but also the queen on f2. So he has to attack that pawn at least 3 times now to be able to win it. White responded with rook c to c1, then rook to e7. Coming back, black wants to triple up on the a file. However, he can't come to a8 right now just because the bishop targets that square. Therefore, he moves the rook to e7, planning on moving to a7 to triple up on the a2 pawn. And here, white moved pawn to f4, which is a little bit too late. After this, black responded with e takes f4, g takes f4, and now rook to a7. And now white is not able to defend the a2 pawn anymore. White's rook on c1 cannot come to c2 to defend the pawn a third time, as the knight will simply capture it. And from here, black was able to win the a2 pawn, and with it also put pressure on the king and win the game in the end. You could see that the knight on d4 is far more superior than the bishop on d5. And this gave black an easy win. So this was another example where you saw the importance of identifying a weak square and how to take advantage of it. Even though this weak square wasn't a considered hole in the enemy's camp, black was able to use his pawns to claim the weak square for his knight, where the white became so strong, putting pressure on white's weaknesses, that eventually led black on winning this game. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for another video where we're going to take a look at some Grandmaster games and also take a look at this idea of weak squares and holes in the enemy camp. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.